Hello and welcome to the Employment Law Pod from Boyce Turner. My name's Andy Whitaker. I'm a partner in the employment team, and I'm very pleased to once again be joined today by my colleague and fellow partner, Helen Goss.
Hi, everyone.
And as before, we're going to be talking about things that we have seen in the news over the last couple of weeks that have piqued our interest that are employment law related. So, Helen, what are we going to be talking about today then?
Well, I'm going to be looking at the issue of hybrid working. And you are going to be looking at the concept of financial wellness and the cost of living burden for employers and employees.
That's right, yes. So why don't we start off with hybrid working then, yes.
Absolutely. Well, hybrid working it's one of those things that either provokes huge hoorays and yays or big boos, depending on your particular perspective. But there's no doubt that the world of work was completely and utterly turned on its head when we went into the pandemic and COVID, and for actually quite a long time. And that's then really where this concept of hybrid working became very popular and frequently talked about. There's no doubt that a lot of businesses have completely and utterly embraced hybrid working. Some clients that we know of have got rid of their offices altogether.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And then, of course, there are other businesses, particularly big global businesses where teams are spread throughout the world, have been operating on a remote hybrid basis for a very long time and well before COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I was seconded to a business for a period of time pre-pandemic, and the HR director that I engaged with every day and various times every day was based in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam.
Exactly. So a lot of businesses are sort of wondering what's the fuss about, because that's the way that they've been operating for quite a long time. But then there are other businesses who have been mandating that people return to the office, sometimes for 2 or 3 days a week, but quite often on a full-time basis. And you remember there was a bit of a furore not that long ago when one of the politicians claimed that civil servants who were working from home were lazy civil servants.
Yes, that'd be news to my wife, who works for the civil service and also works from home.
Yes.
I don't think she'd agree with that categorisation, but there you go.
Well, it's a bit of an odd concept, but it is one that some businesses do have. So it seems to me that there is quite a lot of tension in some businesses between what employers want and what employees want. But of course, everybody's got their eye on that issue of retention of staff, so keeping the talent they've got in the business, and then attraction of new staff. So it's that constant battle and tension that you see. I'll be talking about contracts a bit later. But what I'm seeing, and I don't know if you're seeing it the same, Andy, is there are a lot more flexible working requests.
Yeah, I think that is the case. But I think also because so many businesses are adopting flexible working almost as the default position, then there's also less demand for people to make an application to ask to work flexibly because employers are accommodating it without the necessity of a request to be made. Where we're seeing maybe more requests is where businesses are having a more directive approach around people returning to the workplace. Yeah,
exactly, where they're mandating that people must attend the office. And the flexible working requests are generally about working from home rather than perhaps reduced or different hours. And of course, where those requests are coming from women who perhaps have caring responsibilities, people with disabilities, or maternity returners or adoption returners, then there is a risk for the business with an overall policy that everybody must work from the office. And those risks are constructive, unfair dismissal if someone feels they have no choice but to resign as a consequence of a refusal, or indirect discrimination, because it is mostly women or people with caring responsibilities who are seeking to work from home with the flexible working requests.
And that's over and above the statutory claim that an individual might have if they were to argue that the employer hasn't properly considered a flexible working request.
Absolutely. And I think we covered that in our first podcast, didn't we?
I think so, yeah.
The new rules in respect of flexible working requests. Well, I think that hybrid working is here to stay for the majority of businesses. So I've tried to narrow down the 4 main challenges. And you know how when you read a magazine or read an article, there's always like 4 Bs or 6 Fs.
Everyone loves a bit of alliteration, don't
Well, I've got 4 Cs, Andy.
Good stuff.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes. So we're going to look at communication, connection, creativity, and culture, which I think is probably the big one. I know that's a big thing from your perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm glad they are genuinely all 4 Cs. You haven't tried to crowbar something in there.
I had to work quite hard to get that, but we got there. So the first one then, communication. And of course, that is a huge thing because every business that I've ever worked in or with struggles with communication, whether that's formal communication or informal communication. And the thing that everybody keeps raising now, the conversations around the water cooler. Do we even have water coolers anymore?
Let's say zip tap or something like that, although that's branded, isn't it?
Exactly.
But we know what we're talking about here.
The conversation around the zip tap. And certainly with communications, technology does help us, doesn't it, in remote meetings, but only really when the technology works. We also have WhatsApp and instant messaging, which does help that communication when people are in different locations.
But I think even with stable communication platforms, and I think most businesses have got things that now work for them, it's still not quite the same, is it, interacting in that way?
No, because if you think about a team meeting, so some people will actually physically be there and then others will be on the screen because they're working remotely from home on those days. So yes, that is a hybrid meeting, but it does sometimes feel a little bit awkward. And I think that the person who's chairing the meeting really needs to keep an eye open that they're actually speaking or allowing everybody to speak, and that the meeting isn't taken over by the people who are physically present. Now, I know that when you're chairing our team meetings, you do make quite a thing of making sure that everybody gets an opportunity to speak.
That's kind of you for saying so. But I think you're right, though, that it does bring a new set of skills that people need to learn in how they engage with people in those circumstances.
Exactly. So we've got to make sure that the technology works and also that people understand the etiquette of just because you're physically present doesn't mean you get to dominate the meeting. And that we also have to be conscious and try harder to make sure that people who are working remotely are not feeling left out, or when we know that they're not keen to speak, or making sure that they have a space in which they can speak.
Yes, absolutely. I agree, yeah.
Then connections is one that I always worry about, because we've got to really be mindful that, for example, when people join the business, so in the onboarding process, with junior employees or just teams who are working together but not always in the same place, that everybody feels part of what's happening. So there is a risk that you might be sitting somewhere and think, I don't even know who that person is, because you've not been introduced to that person, whether that's formally through the various communication angles or because you've never actually seen them before because they or you are not in the office that often. So it's again making sure that people aren't left out, especially those who don't push themselves forward. The other thing that I often worry about is the connections, not just internally, but externally. So people making their relationships that will benefit them and others, and their relationships with clients and suppliers going forward. Because it's an essential part of business that people do forge those relationships, and it is much more difficult when they're not actually going out and meeting people.
I think another thing around connections as well, and I apologise, this doesn't begin with a C, so sorry, but I often think about the concept of stickiness.
Yes.
And how pre-COVID, when you had teams that were working closely together and were connected in that way, they just knew each other better. They just had built those connections in a way which are more difficult to build and maintain if people are working remotely. And this is really a retention point, I suppose, that there are many reasons why people might leave a business. It might be for career progression or money or whatever it might be. But where people feel more connected and more sticky to their colleagues and their teams, they have those stronger ties that bind, then that may represent another reason to keep that person in the business, why they might wish to stay because they feel more connected than they might do if they're simply not around as much. They don't have those connections that they might otherwise have with their colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know whether you've had any issue with tribal behaviour as well, because I know that I've had a couple of grievances that I've looked at on behalf of clients where perhaps women or people in ethnic minorities have felt left out because they're not potentially physically present. And so there becomes a tribal behaviour amongst those who are actually present and in the office. So they form a group of people who then are acting in a very excluding fashion towards people who aren't physically present. And they regard themselves as perhaps being a little bit superior because we're here, we're actually progressing our careers, whereas you're just hiding at home.
Yeah, it's an inclusivity point that goes beyond just equality, diversity and inclusivity, if you like. It goes beyond a discrimination point into just more generally speaking, does everyone feel properly included and able to contribute and able to raise their voice and have their voice heard?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll look at that when we get to culture. But creativity and innovation is the other one that I often see as to why flexible working requests are refused when people have put in a request to work from home. So the business is quite keen on this idea of collective creativity and the hive mind, so the unexpected conversations around the zip tap, so those conversations that aren't scheduled or timetabled, and those sparks of creativity which perhaps don't happen if you're not together, physically together, or if you are working home alone much of the time. Can you have those creative sparks when it's just you? I'm not sure I've got an answer to that. I don't know if you've got a view.
No, and I think there will be many people that say, well, I work better in a completely darkened room with no noise around me, and that enables me to really concentrate and I get my best ideas in those circumstances. I'm sure there are people who that works for them. But equally, I'm sure there are many people who feel the need to be able to bounce off, not physically, but have those ideas, be able to spark off other people and be in a sort of creative environment with others to speak to and to discuss ideas with.
Yeah, and can a Teams call be spontaneous and ignite that creativity? So I would probably say possibly yes, because I'm okay with Teams calls in that I'm quite confident speaking. But then somebody who isn't quite so confident isn't perhaps going to enjoy. I mean, we've seen people who just sit in a tiny little space in the corner of a Teams call because they don't like to look at themselves on the screen. People who just don't like speaking in a wider environment. So perhaps those people are missing out. So the business has got to make sure that they create a space for people who are perhaps quieter than others to share their creative ideas, or to make sure that on those days when people are in the office, that's when meetings are held, where that creativity can run free.
And I guess that moves us on to culture, doesn't it?
Culture. Now, that's the big one. I know that's the one that you get quite excited about. So when people are not spending a lot of time together, can you generate that good feeling about the business? It's a really difficult question, and I think most businesses think that perhaps their culture has suffered when they haven't all been together at least some of the time. So how can a business differentiate itself in the search for talent and also in terms of its business relationships with suppliers or clients? But certainly engagement with all of your employees is just so important, because they've all been through such a hard time. They're continuing to go through a hard time, which you're going to talk about in a while. So businesses really do have to think about how they're going to engage with their employees. And I think in the past, everybody used to have an employee of the month scheme, and that seemed to be the biggest point of engagement. But I think that probably doesn't really cut it anymore. And Andy, you and I, we've been judges on the engagement category for the Springboard Awards. Springboard is a charity in the leisure and hospitality sector, and every year they have an awards ceremony where different categories are judged and different people put in their papers to seek to win. And we've had the privilege of looking at a lot of people who've put in papers in respect of employee engagement. And I have to say, it's been a bit mind-blowing in an entirely good way, hasn't it?
It's quite inspirational, to be honest with you. There's been some really fantastic ideas, initiatives, and, as you say, creativity that we've seen from many different businesses trying to take a real positive step in the direction of engaging with their employees and giving them the best possible experience.
No, exactly. So, I mean, they have most definitely moved on from Employee of the Month and just the odd social engagement. They're looking at portals so that everybody can properly hear and understand communications, road shows where people are physically going around all the sites and having question and answer sessions, surveys. There seems to be a huge reliance on engagement surveys. And then the important point is not just hearing what people are not happy about, but actually then going back with, well, we've done that, we've listened, and so now this is how we're proposing to deal with that situation. And then repeating the survey a few months later to see if their engagement has gone up. Focusing on development and training programs, coaching and mentoring, that seems now to be a very common way of developing engagement. And of course then wellness and well-being initiatives, which would include financial well-being as well. So I just wanted to touch, before I hand over to you, Andy, the legal position in respect of contracts and employers requiring people to attend the office some of the time or all of the time. And I think that it's about going back to your contract, essentially. Now, most contracts will have the place of work as being the base for an employee to work from. On that basis, it's probably going to be possible for an employer to require their employees to come back into the office. And that's obviously going to be subject to reasonable adjustments or successful flexible working requests. It might not result in a happy workforce, but I think that if the business is determined that people must work in the office and that their contract backs that up, then I think that the business is entitled to do that.
Ultimately, it's up to every business to decide what works for it, not just in terms of productivity, but also in terms of culture and how they want to build and where they see the business progressing to in the future. Everyone will come up with a slightly different answer to that because they have different demands. They're at different stages of the cycle of that business perhaps as well. But it's identifying what you think works for you rather than just taking an off-the-peg solution and making sure that you communicate that clearly to your people so they understand what it is that you're doing and why it is that you're doing it as well. And you can hopefully take them on the journey with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Helen. That's been really, really interesting as always.
Right. So, Andy, we've had a little break. So tell us about loud budgeting.
Yes, we're recording this just before Easter, so that means it's the end of the tax year, just about to come up. And for many businesses, it means it's the end of the financial year, which then also means that there's been potentially some budgeting exercises.
Painful, aren't they, Andy?
They are indeed. And businesses are deciding what the shape of their organisation looks like next year. We've seen in the news that inflation is starting to come down, but of course, that simply means that prices are going up less fast than they were before. It doesn't mean prices are coming down. And it's not always possible for employers to pass on or businesses to pass on those additional costs to their clients or customers. It means that employers and employees are being squeezed. It is the case that employees are seeing their cost of living go up, but businesses are as well. Their cost of productions are going up. So both employers and employees are being squeezed. And therefore, it's not always possible for employers to make pay awards that keep up with inflation. And that's been the case for the last couple of years. And it means that for many individuals, many employees, they will have seen a real-term pay cut over the last couple of years. In fact, there's probably very few people out there that have managed to keep pace with inflation in terms of their pay awards over the last couple of years.
Yes, and it's causing quite a lot of financial hardship for some people, isn't it?
That's right. But as I said, it's not always possible for employers to offer larger pay rises, nor is it possible always to offer additional hours, overtime, that kind of thing to help bridge the gap. So what can businesses do about this? What should they be doing? Well, the last couple of weeks, I've become aware of a trend on TikTok.
That's not like you, Andy.
No, I know, but I'm keeping my finger on the pulse. And there was also an article about it in the Big Issue this week as well. Gosh. And this is the trend of loud budgeting. Now, I'm already in my mind's eye seeing my teenage daughter's eyes rolling at the prospect of me as a man in my mid-40s trying to describe a TikTok trend, but I'm going to do my best. And what it is essentially being more open and honest about financial constraints. And it's encouraging people to take a more proactive attitude towards engaging with their peers and their friends about what they can and what they can't do. Now, this is just a trend on TikTok, isn't it? I mean, how much attention do we need to pay of this? Well, there was a Forbes survey that was completed recently that found that 80% of millennials and Gen Zers take financial advice from TikTok.
Gosh.
Would you believe it?
No.
So people are influenced about what they read here, and they take an impression of the way that they should be acting. And the loud part of it is really important because it is about having those open and honest conversations. And it is encouraging people to say where, for example, there's an expensive birthday lunch that's been organised or a dinner or whatever it might be, having the confidence to be able to say to your friends, actually, my payday isn't until the end of next week or whenever it might be. Can we do something a bit cheaper maybe, or can we explore a different option?
So do you mean taking the shame out of not being able to afford to do something?
It's exactly that. Yeah. It's exactly that, because what we're seeing is that so few people, I think there was another survey that I saw where 1/3 of Brits apparently are too uncomfortable to chat about money.
Yes.
People really find it difficult to be honest about the situations they find themselves in and what they can and can't do. So as I said, this loudness is important. And it's not about necessarily missing out. So it's not about giving up on things. So, you will hear people talk about, well, the reason that Gen Zers can't buy their own homes is because they're drinking too much coffee. Well, I think that rather oversimplifies the challenges faced around house prices and average salaries. But it's not about necessarily giving up your expensive coffees. It's saying, well, actually, I have finite resources and I want to keep those nice things. I want to have those coffees. So what does that mean actually for my budgeting and what I can and can't afford to do? And I need to have a sensible conversation about that and really take a positive and proactive approach to what I can and can't do. So what can we learn from this from an employment perspective and as employers? Well, I think it is about encouraging that honesty and encouraging people to feel free to talk about the challenges that they face and to be able to look to others for support and to both take and provide advice. Over the last year or so, we've seen quite a few employers lead the way with appointing a cost of living champion, for example.
Gosh, yes.
So that focal point for someone to go and be able to have those conversations with, to share their position, to discuss options, to discuss...
So this is the financial well-being aspect of engagement, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly that. And employers may be arranging a financial well-being lunch or a forum or somewhere where people can feel psychologically safe to have those conversations and to not be judged and to be honest about what they're doing and what their experiences are. A lot of that, the loud budgeting trend, if you like, on TikTok is about being able to say, well, this is what I've experienced. So this is what's happened to me. These are the mistakes that maybe I've made, that I've learned from, and that I'm not going to make again. And that sharing that experience enables other people to learn from those mistakes, but then also potentially to pass on advice about things that's worked for them instead. So that's something that employers can replicate. And it's something that employers can replicate at a relatively low cost. As I said, budgets are squeezed. It's not always possible to spend a lot of money on new initiatives or drives or offerings. But this is something that's pretty low cost that you can do that employees might feel a real benefit from in being able to engage in those sort of discussions.
What about other benefits? Are you seeing, do you think, a change in the types of benefits that are available to employees?
Well, I think so. I think so. As many businesses are thinking about that, and they're thinking, okay, well, what can we provide? So is there a way, for example, for us to set up signposting services for where individuals can receive support or advice on managing their budgets better. Can, for example, an employer provide access to a financial advisor? Is that something that individuals might feel the benefit of? Do you engage with your employees about putting in place strategies for budgeting as well? Perhaps encouraging individuals to think about the importance of emergency fund. If the car breaks down, for example, and it's expensive to fix, and if you don't fix it, you can't travel to work, for example, having a bit of money set aside to enable you to do that, to get the car back on the road again, is a really important thing to do. So just talking about those little rainy day things and just managing your finances in the best way that you can so that you avoid those sort of problems if they arise and you're able to militate the damage of them. Another aspect that we've seen increasingly arise, I think, is the issues around second jobs.
Oh, now then, that's a big subject and a slightly touchy one as well, isn't it?
It is.
A contractual issue as well.
It can be a contractual issue. So whether or not this is a particular concern will depend upon the nature of your business. So for many organisations, they will have provisions in their contracts which expressly state, for example, you can't go and work for a competitive organisation while you're engaged by us.
Which makes sense, really, doesn't it?
But also there might be provisions as well which say, and you can't do anything during our working hours. So we don't want people doing side hustles and moonlighting in other roles when they're supposed to be working for us. And that can be a concern if, for example, people are working in a hybrid environment.
Yes.
How closely could or should you be monitoring what individuals are doing when they are working from home?
Yeah.
And is it possible that they are doing something else on the side that you are unaware of and almost sort of doing two jobs at the same time? You hear urban myths about this from time to time, but as with all of these things, they tend to have a kernel of truth to them. And I'm sure there are, although I haven't dealt with any anecdotally or that have come across my desk, I'm sure there are circumstances where individuals have been doing this. And that would be in breach of contractual provisions that require you to spend your full-time attention.
To dedicate, isn't it?
Exactly.
That's the terminology.
During your working hours to working on your job. But even outside of that, you might have, for example, individuals who work a day job but then want to work an evening job as well to earn
or
extra money.
Or perhaps need to work
exactly
a second job.
That, yes, quite so. So where does an employer sit in those sort of circumstances? Is that something that you could or should care about, for example? If it's being done outside of working hours, then what right have you got to say to the individual that you have an issue with that, for example? Well, normally, again, contracts might include a provision which says you shouldn't take on any employment which might affect your ability to do our work for us and to undertake your contractual duties. And I suppose there may be circumstances where someone is working nights as well as days, for example.
So they're not performing because they're overtired.
Exactly. That can impact on productivity and all of those sort of issues that might be of a concern to an employer. But over and above that, there's also issues about working time.
Oh, yeah.
Because, there are restrictions and rules, which I'm not going to go into in the great detail of, but there are restrictions and rules on how many hours of work an individual should be working. So over and above your actual just general well-being concerns for your employee and also ensuring they're doing their job to their best of ability that you pay them for, there also may be issues around working in excess of the allowed working time limits too. So there's issues around second jobs. Employers want to be encouraging individuals to be honest about this. Again,
yes.
This is creating this psychological safety and encouraging people to be frank and open with their managers. If there's something that they have to do, then we want them to tell us about it so that we understand. We can check, first of all, whether or not we're happy with that and whether that is something that we either need to give our consent to or not. But even if it's something that actually they're perfectly entitled to do, we still want to just make sure that the employees are okay as well. And we want to make sure that
their well-being.
We
need to be mindful of their well-being. Yeah.
Exactly that. So again, we want people to be honest so that we can manage that situation. And then just a few other thoughts about cost of living. Some businesses are able to offer early pay rises, for example. I know that's something you've
bring them forward. You mean
bring them forward exactly. So I know it's something you've been looking at with a couple of clients. Also, cost of living bonuses as well.
Yeah.
It might not be possible to pay an ongoing increased salary, but it might be possible to offer some sort of bonus or some sort of contribution in recognition of those rising costs. And then finally, you mentioned before about benefits. Many employers are very good about assessing their benefits on a regular basis, but others aren't. And you might have a very generous benefits package, but that might have been suitable 10 years ago, or even pre-pandemic, or even maybe immediately post-pandemic.
Is it fit for purpose, really, isn't
Exactly that. And some of the things that we offer, some of the things that we do, some of the things that we make available to our employees, are they actually meeting their needs right now? And is there something else that they might much prefer? It might be a tradition within the organisation to spend a lot of money on big parties, big social events, big occasions, taking people away on trips, that sort of thing. Do employees actually want that? Would they much prefer actually a free gym membership because that saves them some money, or free breakfast being provided for them when they come in the morning, or whatever it might be? That goes again to the points you were making about communication, and about asking.
Or a survey, even.
Yeah, exactly. About asking your employees what they want, listening, and then actually providing them with what they want.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Really interesting subjects. And in fact, I was just thinking that perhaps the issue of psychological safety might be something we could talk about at our next podcast, because I'm seeing that so much at the moment, particularly in grievances.
I'm writing that down in my notebook as we speak.
Excellent, excellent. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. We release regular episodes on employment themes. Just subscribe or follow the podcast and you'll be able to listen to them as soon as they're available. So thanks again for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.